All right, so we're diving into some pretty unsettling stuff today. We're talking
Yeah.
about Donald Trump and his language, specifically that phrase he keeps using, the enemy within.
Yeah, it's certainly a loaded phrase, especially given, well, the historical context.
Right, and it's not just the words themselves. Trump's hinting at actually using military force against, well, basically anyone who disagrees with him, which is, pretty concerning.
Absolutely.
We've got a ton of sources you guys sent in on this, the Washington Post, CNN, The Atlantic. It seems like everyone's talking about it. But to help us really unpack this, we've got our expert speaker here who knows a thing or two about political history and rhetoric.
Well, it's certainly a recurring theme throughout history, this idea of an enemy within.
So, like, what's the historical context here? I mean, it sounds like something straight out of a dictator's playbook.
It practically is. I mean, you can trace this tactic back to ancient Rome. Julius Caesar used it against the Senate, fueled that paranoia.
Yeah.
And more recently, McCarthyism during the Red Scare, that's a prime example. But the most chilling examples, the 20th century, Hitler, Stalin, they were masters of manipulating this enemy within narrative.
And it's terrifying because it works,
Right.
right? It creates this climate of fear and suspicion where suddenly violence seems like the only answer.
Exactly. You dehumanize your opponents, make them out to be some existential threat, and it becomes much easier to justify extreme measures. And that's what makes Trump's recent comments so concerning.
Like, specifically his comments about using the National Guard.
Yeah, it's one thing to use inflammatory rhetoric, but when you start talking about deploying troops against your own citizens, that's when it really escalates to a whole other level.
And to make matters worse, his campaign's trying to connect this to the arrest of that Afghan man who was planning an attack.
Right, trying to equate anyone who criticizes the election with terrorism, it's a classic authoritarian tactic.
So basically, he's taking a page straight out of the dictator's playbook.
Mhm.
And we know he's expressed admiration for certain strongmen who weren't exactly known for their love of democracy.
Yeah, and not just any strongman. Jeffrey Goldberg had that piece in The Atlantic recently where he quotes Trump as saying, "I need the kind of generals that Hitler had."
Hold on, he actually said that.
Allegedly, yes. And not only that, but he went on to say that he wanted generals who were totally loyal, who wouldn't hesitate to follow his orders no matter what.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, it suggests that he sees the military as his own personal force, not as defenders of the Constitution.
Which is, the entire point of the U.S. military. They swear an oath to the Constitution, not to any individual, least of all the president.
And it's not just talk, right? We've seen how he treats anyone who dares to criticize him, even retired generals like McChrystal and McRaven.
Oh, absolutely. There were reports he wanted to court-martial them just for speaking out against him.
Like, imagine that being punished for exercising your First Amendment rights. It's straight out of, like, some dystopian novel.
And let's not forget his reaction to the George Floyd protests. Reports of him asking if the army could just shoot protesters.
It's like he has absolutely no regard for the rule of law, for basic human rights.
Yeah.
And that's what makes all of this so deeply, deeply unsettling. It's really scary to think about, honestly.
Yeah, the potential consequences are pretty terrifying when you really start to, think about it.
And it seems like this disdain, this contempt, it isn't just limited to, like, active military, but extends to veterans themselves. Goldberg's article in The Atlantic, he uncovered some really shocking comments Trump allegedly made about veterans.
Yeah, it's pretty hypocritical when you think about it. I mean, here's a guy who constantly wraps himself in the flag, claims to support the troops, but then in private, he's saying these incredibly disrespectful things.
Right. It's like this weird double standard. On the one hand, you see him at rallies praising veterans, calling them heroes. And then on the other hand,
You have these private comments, these reported incidents that paint a very different picture.
it's really bizarre. Do you think it's all just an act? Like, is it all calculated?
That's the question, isn't it? I mean, how much of it is genuine and how much of it is, political strategy? It's something historians will probably be debating for years. But one thing that's clear from everything we're seeing, all these sources, is that there's a pretty consistent pattern of behavior here. And it's definitely cause for concern.
Totally. And it's not just about, disrespecting veterans. It's about this broader pattern of demonizing anyone who disagrees with him.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, like, what's really at the root of all of this? This is where Anne Applebaum's piece in The Atlantic really gets into some interesting territory. She basically comes right out and says it. Trump's rhetoric is speaking like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini.
Right. And she draws these really unsettling parallels between Trump's language and the language used by, fascist regimes throughout history. And it's all about dehumanizing the opposition.
Like when he calls his opponents vermin. That's just, I mean, it sends chills down my spine.
It's chilling, and it's intentional. She also talks about how Trump says immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. This isn't just your average political attack. This kind of language, it taps into something much darker, something much more dangerous.
And it feels like he's tapping into something that's, like, deeply rooted in our history, unfortunately.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Those terms, vermin, blood purity, they weren't just random insults. They were absolutely central to the propaganda used by the Nazis, by other totalitarian regimes, to justify genocide. It's terrifying how easily those ideas can resurface.
So even if Trump isn't consciously trying to, incite violence,
Yeah.
by using this kind of language, he's playing with fire.
Exactly. He's normalizing this rhetoric, this kind of language that should be unthinkable in a democracy. And history shows us time and time again, when you start dehumanizing your opponents, it becomes much easier to justify violence against them. It's a slippery slope, and it can happen very quickly.
And it's not just theoretical, right? I mean, we saw what happened on January 6th. Words have power, and they can have very real, very dangerous consequences.
Absolutely. And Applebaum, she makes this chilling point. What if Trump's using these tactics intentionally? What if he's seen how effective they can be and is actively trying to exploit that?
It's a terrifying thought, but is it so far-fetched? I mean, are we really at risk of falling into that kind of authoritarianism?
It's a question that keeps historians up at night. I mean, there's no easy answer. But we do know that democracies are fragile. They require constant vigilance, a commitment to upholding those democratic values. And when a leader starts using this kind of language, when they start undermining the institutions that hold our society together, it's a huge red flag.
It's like slow poison, right?
Yeah.
It can erode even the strongest foundations over time.
Precisely. And the scariest part is it can happen so gradually, so subtly, that by the time people realize what's happening, it might be too late. It's like that old saying, first they came for. Oh, and you know the rest.
Yeah. It's a chilling reminder that we can't afford to be complacent.
Yeah.
We can't just brush this off as, oh, that's just Trump being Trump.
Exactly. We have to call it out for what it is. Dangerous, undemocratic, and potentially destructive. Silence is not an option here.
So what can we do? I mean, this is all starting to feel incredibly bleak.
Well, the first step is awareness, right? Recognizing the patterns, refusing to become numb to this kind of language. We have to stay informed, engaged, and vigilant.
And we have to talk to each other, right?
Yeah.
Even when it's hard, even when it feels like we're just talking past each other.
Exactly. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. We have to be active participants, engage in dialogue, and be willing to defend those democratic principles.
This has been a lot to process. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about Trump's admiration for dictators.
And their absolute control over the military.
Right, and how that ties into this whole enemy within narrative. It all circles back to this unsettling possibility that Trump sees the military not as defenders of the Constitution, but as a tool to be used against his enemies, both foreign and, most warningly, domestic.
It really is concerning. And I think that's a good place to, transition back to the heart of this whole conversation. You know, our listener wrote in asking, is Trump a fascist dictator waiting to happen?
Right, and that's the million-dollar question.
It really is. So, what do you think? Are we overreacting here? Or is there a real danger with this kind of rhetoric, this behavior?
Well, I'm not in the business of predicting the future, and I think it's important to avoid making those kinds of definitive statements about anyone's intentions. But I do think the sources you've shared, they paint a pretty clear picture.
Okay, so what do you mean? Look, when a leader, especially one with a devoted following, someone who's shown a pattern of inciting violence, when they start using language like enemy within, radical left lunatics, when they threaten military action against their own citizens, well, it creates this climate where violence feels, I don't know, almost inevitable.
It's like he's normalizing violence as an acceptable solution to, political disagreements.
Exactly. And it's not even just about physical violence, right? It's about this erosion of trust, this complete breakdown of civil discourse.
Right. Like we can't even have a conversation anymore without it devolving into name-calling and personal attack.
Exactly. And that's incredibly dangerous for a democracy. If we can't disagree peacefully, if we can't have these difficult conversations without resorting to threats and demonization, well, what are we left with?
So, I mean, I hate to keep bringing it back to this, but is that what we're talking about here? Like, is this how democracies die? Is that too extreme?
I don't think it's extreme to be concerned, given the historical parallels we've discussed. Look, authoritarianism, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process, a slow erosion of norms, of institutions.
So Like, what do we do? How do we fight back against that?
Well, I think awareness is key, right? Recognizing the patterns, refusing to become numb to this kind of language. We have to stay informed, we have to stay engaged, and we can't let our guard down.
So basically, we can't just tune it out, even if it's exhausting.
Exactly. And, as cliche as it sounds, we have to talk to each other, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it feels like we're talking past each other.
Because silence is basically just like letting it happen.
Exactly. Democracy requires participation. It requires us to speak up, to defend those democratic principles, even, and maybe especially when it's hard.
Well, that's a pretty powerful message to end on. And to our listener who sent in all these sources, who clearly cares deeply about this, thank you. Thank you for getting this conversation started.
Yes, thank you. And please don't stop asking these tough questions. Don't stop engaging in these conversations. And don't ever underestimate the power of your own voice.
And to everyone listening, keep those questions coming and keep fighting for the kind of world you want to live in. To catch you guys on the next Deep Dive.